Hi, Misha here, and this is the third video, kind of in my birthday celebration. It's a couple of days late for various reasons. Unfortunately, the real world and life. But the good news is, we are going to talk about airplanes. Even better, some of my favorite, and some of the hardest to find, because I do 1/72 scale diecast, MiGs. Now looking here, we've got the MiG-15 Figut. That's the NATO name, don't ask me. And we have the MiG-17. This is actually a new paint from Hobby Master I picked up a while back that I just want to talk about. It's kind of North Vietnamese styling. And then, of course, the famous MiG-21. I brought it out mostly for comparison, bringing in... Oh, something fell. Nothing important. So we've got MiG-15, MiG-17, MiG-21. We have a missing MiG in the series. We have the MiG-23, we have the MiG-25, we have the MiG-29, and actually this year Hobby Master announced they were doing a MiG-31. We still have a missing MiG, and in a lot of ways, it's important. My wife and I were talking, and it was about time to kind of buckle down for holidays, so no more spending, no more Star Wars, no more models for a bit, just because. And there wasn't much I wanted. And I haven't really been keeping up with the diecast world because of pricing lately. Then I happened to take a gander over to the Flying Mule, and immediately ran in and said, yeah, I just ordered something. Out of nowhere, a MiG-19 Farmer popped up. Yeah, I guess because this faggot was that, they went with Farmer. This is 1/72 scale diecast, but it's from Panzerkampf. I've had a mixed experience with that brand, so I was a little uncertain what this model would turn out to be. So, we're going to talk about the history of the MiG-19, and talk about this Panzerkampf diecast 172 Russian VVS. Is it worth it? When I opened it, was I disappointed or pleasantly surprised? But first, we'll just have a quick recap of the 15 and 17th to put the 19 in context. And Hobo decided to join us, so you'll hear meowing. Yes, Hobo. I know you're an expert on MiGs, Hobo, but let me do this. The MiG-15, along with the F-86 Sabre, probably the first truly successful jet fighters. This was built using a lot of technology scavenged from Nazi Germany, including the swept wing. It was really the first successful mass-produced swept wing fighter, about a 35-degree wing. It used a Rolls-Royce, or at least a copy of it, jet engine. First flew at the end of 1947. First production models made in 1948, and then nominally put into service in 1949 in time for the Korean War. And they would build a lot of these. They would build over 13,600, 700, and it would serve with over 20 nations. It was armed with two 23mm cannon, 80 rounds each, and one 37mm cannon with 40 rounds. No missiles, this is way before that. Did have an ejection seat, and this was still a subsonic jet. It, about 680 miles per hour max speed. It would get up to about Mach 0.8, skirting a little higher, but then controls got a little iffy. It definitely couldn't go supersonic, at least not unless it was diving and out of control, but it was a relatively fast jet, nimble, all metal, and easy to produce. Max altitude was over 50,000 feet. Its most, distinguishing feature were its hard-hitting cannon. And it's just simple operations. And they would make a 2-seat training version as well. This is the 15 Biz, the mass-produced version, the kind of second generation. And this, like I said, was called the Faggot by NATO. That was its reporting name. And it would lead directly to this one over here. The MiG MiG-17 reporting name Fresco. This started off as an improved MiG-15, sometimes called 1545, but eventually enough changes were made that it was given a new designation. This first flew as a prototype in 1950, and it was introduced into service in 1952, although in the Soviet Union mass production was somewhat delayed so that more MiG-15s could be sent over to fight in the Korean War. Nevertheless, by the mid-50s, this was the primary aircraft in Russia. It's very similar. The original MiG-15 was 33 feet by 33 feet. This adjusts that slightly to about 36 feet by 32 feet. It is a little faster. This is considered high transonic. It could get up to about Mach 0.9, up to about 712 mph if it used the afterburner. This version here, the Fresco C, also known as the MiG-17F in Russia, introduced the afterburner. It also had a Russian copy of the American gun sight from the F-86. This is the primary production version. It had the same 3 cannon with the same payload. Interestingly, though, whereas the MiG-15 was designed as a bomber interceptor, the MiG-17 from the outset was designed in 2 versions, a tactical fighter and a radar-equipped interceptor, because this is about the time that missiles were coming around. Now, this model here, like I said, came out from Hobby Master, and it's in Vietnamese paint. I thought it was neat. And just for fun, a while back, I stuck missiles on it. It didn't come with it. I was just having fun, and when I went to take it off the shelf, I was surprised they had stayed on all this time, so I left them on. The 17P and then PU versions, well, the 17P was radar-equipped, used cannon. The 17PU was the first to have missiles, but they were the early K5s, not terribly useful, but hey, you got to start somewhere, right? Those came around 1956. So we had 2 basic product lines there. They wouldn't build as many of these, 10, 11,000, but they would actually serve with more nations, about 25. It was a very successful design, especially outside of Russia. The Chinese would have a version known as the J5 built there. They called the MiG-15 built in Russia in their service the J2, and the MiG-17 built in Russia in Chinese service the J4. They never did a 2-seat training version, though. They just used the MiG-15 for it. Although in China, they did have the JJ5, which was an interesting critter. But I thought this was a neat model, just for the Vietnamese collection, because that's what was primarily used in the Vietnam War until the MiG-21 came around. You had the MiG-17 here. And it's just a product-improved aircraft, but very, very similar. By the way, it does have a higher max altitude of about 54,000 feet as well. But it's still using 1 engine. It still is not supersonic. And, there's room for improvement. And in the 1950s was the time for lots of improvement in the aircraft industry. And that's why I was so excited to get the MiG-19. Let's see how the model looks. I wasn't sure how this would fit on the spinny thing with this different stand. The stand itself really reminds me of what Caliber Wings uses, but more on the model in a minute. Where does the MiG-19 fit in? Well, it's kind of the last and the first of something, mostly the last. It's very much analogous to the American F-100 Super Sabre, maybe a plane that's a bit forgotten today, but very important in the grand scheme. These were the first supersonic jets, at least ones that could go supersonic under their own power in leveled flight. Work at the MiG Design Bureau began in 1950. They were hoping to make an aircraft faster than the MiG-15, and at that time MiG-1545, and hopefully with longer range. That supersonic goal was just tantalizingly out of reach but in sight. So what they decided to do, they would fit 2 engines instead of 1, and they would use a new engine that had recently been developed by the Tupolev Tu-216 bomber. fitted in there, and there you go. They received approval in 1951 to convert one of the MiG-17 prototypes, and this would become the SM-1, or if you want to use the old style designating, the I-340. That's how they used to name planes in Russia for a bit. The SM-1 was just a proof of concept, a test bed, because it was just a MiG-17 with new engines put in and whatnot. It would fly in late 1951 and was generally considered successful, and so the program was authorized to go forward, and this would lead us to the SM-2. The SM-2 was the first true purpose-built airframe, and it would be delivered in the spring of 1952, flying for the first time on May 24, 1952, and it was generally a success, but it had some handling issues and other things, so work would commence. And this was about the same time the MiG-17F, the Fresco C, was about to be developed with an afterburner, so subsequent versions would have afterburners, and this really pushed the aircraft up to where it needed to be. So they took the Tupolev type engine and put an afterburner on it, 2 of them in the fuselage, boom, Bob's your uncle. So work would continue, and there would be actually 2 versions made. Just like with the MiG-17, there would be a daytime fair weather fighter, and there would be an interceptor with a radar. The interceptor prototype was called SM-7, and they were up to SM-9 for kind of the advanced test prototype for the what have you. It would fly in January of 1954, and only a month later, the brass would order it into full production as the MiG-19. This is an all-new airframe. It's about 41 feet long total, with about a 30-foot wingspan. So we kind of see that less wide and longer progressing. It has an all-new wing. The MiG-15 had a 35-degree sweep. The MiG-17 was actually a compound from 45 to 42. This wing was designed specifically for supersonic flight with a 55-degree angle in 1 fence per wing. Now, the original I-340 or SM-1 types had and even the first 2s, had a kind of T-tail like the 17 with traditional flaps and what have you. But later prototypes, also known as I-360, like the SM-9, we went to an all-moving slab tail, as you see here. That was to fix some problems. They also found several problems with early production because it was rushed. Nothing major, just the fact that some of them were exploding in flight. Oops. Turns out there was not proper insulation between the fuel tanks and the engines, so that would do it. They ended up very rapidly installing a heat shield that mostly addressed that problem. That, plus adjusting the elevators and whatnot, corrected quite a bit. This would eventually lead to the MiG-19S, which was the main production version that we see here for the daylight fighter. The MiG-19P would be the radar-equipped version, with the PM being the first to carry missiles. It carried 4 of the K-5s, analogous to the MiG-17PU. Those came around the same time, 1956, 1957. The VVS did start receiving these in 1955 and putting them through their paces. And it was truly a supersonic craft. It could get up to about Mach 1.2, well over 800 miles per hour. It had a higher max ceiling of over 57,000 feet. But because it had 2 engines, maintenance time was higher. Fuel consumption was higher. So even though MiG kind of started off wanting to produce something with a longer range, the truth is it was pretty thirsty, even with drop tanks, slip tanks. But in other ways, it was a very standard Russian jet, taking after its MiG-15 and MiG-17 parents. but they would not build near as many of these. In fact, they wouldn't quite build 2,200 in Russia. But China, who, like I said, had built the MiG-17 as the J-5, they would build quite a large number of the MiG-19 as the J-6. And it's actually these that probably became more famous in history. Nevertheless, the MiG-19S and the MiG-19PM did serve with the Russian Air Force and Russian Self-Defense Air Force through the 1960s and 70s. Production would end in Russia around 1968 in favor of newer designs. Much like the F-100 Super Sabre, this was ahead of the curve when it was introduced. In fact, it was the first successful mass-produced supersonic jet. But of course, our MiG-21 over here would come along a very short time later and kind of own it, if we're being honest. Nevertheless, Vietnam actually did reveal that in some situations the MiG-19 was superior. By the way, it was armed with 3 cannon. Originally, the prototypes had 2 37mm cannon. They always had to move them to kind of the fuselage, the wing root, to work with the ingestion of the 2 engines, the more powerful engines. But the production models actually had 3 cannon, all 30mm. They switched from 37 to 30, kind of a compromise. And the 2 in the wings had 75 rounds, so near as many as the 23mm shells on the other planes. And the fuselage had 55, so still more than the 37mm cannon had on the 15 and the 17. It also had 4 hard points under the wings, although 2 of them were pretty much dedicated for fuel tanks. The other 2 could carry small bombs or rocket pods. And yeah, about it. It was a pretty fast jet with high fuel consumption. But aside from needing to maintain 2 engines, pretty reliable and easy to mass produce, at least compared to Western jets. Very economical. Speaking of economy, you know, this model was pretty expensive. And it was from a brand that I have mixed feelings about. You know, if I see a model for over $100 from Hobby Master, I know what I'm getting. Same with Corgi. Panzerkampf is new, and they seem to be using kind of other people's stuff sometimes. What are we getting here? Because this is not cheap. As I said, the stand is very much like what Caliber Wings offers. Now, the actual sticks are almost identical, probably are, including the interchangeable top parts. You get 3 flat ones. You also get a bag with a couple of other stems and ball tips. And this is configurable. The base definitely seems a little bit cheaper than what Caliber ships. Certainly, it's not the weighted type. But generally speaking, as long as you're careful with these stands and have them really tightened down, they are dynamic and they are useful. I've seen worse. And for a relatively lightweight model like this, yeah, they work fine. Including a stand like this as opposed to some of the other cheaper ones is a good start. Because it especially with the extras. Because Panzerkampf is supposed to be more of an economy brand, but not an economy price. So let's talk about our jet itself. I was fully prepared to be disappointed with this, or at least whatever. But you know what? I wanted a MiG-19 so bad to complete the lineup. I was willing to give it a lot of slack, but could I tolerate it? Well, let's see. The first hint I had that this might be different from past Panzerkampf was the box. It has the Velcro front here. It has some foam and stuff inside. It actually kind of has a tray system. There's a plastic outer part, and then there's a couple of pieces of foam, which is nice. It actually keeps your stand and accessories and plane all on a different kind of level. So right off the bat, the packaging looks nicer than what I've seen before from them. For example, their Rafales, their Dassaults. In fact, the packaging kind of reminds me of Caliber wings again. I wonder if that's going to be a theme. As to the plane itself, guys, this thing's all metal. And I don't just mean like all metal, lightweight. It actually feels solid. The fuselage is the canopy does slide. I stuck a Hobby Master pilot in it. It didn't come with a pilot. I looked and looked again, but they never said it would, so hey. And also, again, kind of like on the caliber wings, and something I like about them, the stuff sticking out is more of a flexible rubber material. Now, I'm sure it can break, but it's not. It'll bend before it breaks. I really like that. So that's, of course, kind of rubbery. But the tail, horizontal, vertical, metal, wings, all metal. Underside, all metal. It does have gear up or down. And it has some features that I thought were really neat. Of course, it came with some tanks and stuff. And on most models, you just slot them in, peg them in. These, here's another tank. They're magnetic. And not kind of wimpy magnetic. Good magnetic. The doors for the landing gear are magnetic. Even one other piece is magnetic. This is our pitot tube. Take it off. One famous thing about the MiG-19 is the tube moves upwards for when it's on the ground, so people don't bunk their heads in it. Full disclosure, I bunked my head on a pitot tube when I was in an air show as a kid. So if you want, you can actually plug it in with the ground style pitot tube. Pitot tube if you prefer. Like this. And even though it's a very small part, it actually holds in pretty good with a magnet. But if it's on a shelf, it's not going to break. It'll just come off. I think that is really clever. Again, it may not be the most secure, but if you really had to, you could just glue it. But with pitot tubes, I just think they break too easily. They bend too easy. Not being able to see, it's a little hard for me to line this up, but I can get it. But it's a neat idea, and I wondered why they gave 2 tubes. I'm like, wait, the MiG-19 only has 1 pitot tube. Well, that's why. And again, if it gets knocked on a shelf, which, probably will, it'll just fall off, but stick it back on. And worst, you can lose a little blue tack. But the magnets on this seem to be the right level of magnet. Not too hard, but not gonna shake off. And yeah, it does come with a little screwdriver looking tool to move stuff around on the model if you do. It also has deployable air brakes and some other moving parts and probably some other features that I haven't quite discovered yet. Guys, this is a Caliber Wings. At least this might have been tooling that Caliber Wings was working on. I know they were working on some of the earlier Sukhois. It's not quite as well painted, but it seems like the tooling was originally started for them and then maybe picked up by someone else. I don't know the story. Chinese factories get weird like that. But everything kind of points to something they would have designed, including magnets and all that. But losing all the things they forgot with the Sukhoi Su-24 and some of their their F-14s. Do I still think it's a little overpriced at over $100? I do. I don't feel as bad now. I was going to get it either way. And no one else does a MiG-19 in 172 scale diecast, at least worth a damn. So your other options are basically plastic models. This is better, and it's got good weight to it, so it'll fit in well with my Hobby Masters and Corgis in the MiG series. I am almost 100% satisfied with this, from the stand to the plane. And if they did more, either 19s like a PM, I'd buy it, or I'd love to see them do some of like the Su-9, Su-15. I'd be down for that. What do you think? How do you like MiGs? Well, let's wrap this up with a bit more history and go back to Vietnam. As I said, the 19 entered into Soviet service in 1955. It would be both in the Russian Air Force and the Air Self-Defense or Air Defense Forces. And it would also serve in smaller numbers with the Soviet Marine, the Naval Air Forces arm as well. They would primarily deploy it as an interceptor, not only out of Russia, USSR itself, but also out of East Germany. Even though they would have both the 19S and 19P, yeah, that seems to be kind of what they used it for. And it would be very quickly shown to the public. This wasn't a top secret project. To be fair, why would it be? It's just a faster, more maneuverable version with very hard-hitting cannon compared to the other ones. More ammo. But it was pretty quiet for a couple of years. In 1957, a Russian aircraft tried to intercept a U-2, but it was not successful. To be fair, it had to close quite a gap. I think it was about 3 kilometers, but it didn't. They would fly around for a bit. In 1960, there would be some events. Many folks know, of course, about Francis Powers' U-2 being shot down. But quite tragically for Russia, a MiG-19 was also shot down by friendly fire during that incident because of the relative primitive air defense missiles, and the pilot was killed. In July 1st of 1960, a MiG-19 shot down a reconnaissance aircraft, and this was a bit of an international scandal. Not only did it kill part of the crew, it was claimed that it wasn't over Russian airspace, it was international waters, over the Arctic Circle, yada, yada, yada. It was kind of a kerfuffle. But, it stayed in service. It would start to leave frontline air defense service in the mid-60s, and by the 70s was being phased out in Russia. But even though its service was only about a decade there, in foreign militaries, it would serve for about a generation longer. Vietnam would have its first MiGs, at least Russian, Chinese, as early as 1960. But it really wouldn't form its first air group, at least officially, with Vietnamese pilots until 1964, and it would quickly have 2 air groups. By 1965, it was operating several MiGs, 15s, 17s, and its first 19s, although in very small numbers. Actually, it wouldn't be until 1968 that it would get MiG-19s in any numbers to really speak of. But regardless, this would give America a bit of a black eye, because F-104s, F-105s, even early F-4s were being shot down by these subsonic planes, and even what was considered to be an inferior supersonic Russian plane. And they had one advantage. They had cannon when some of the American planes at this time did not. They were also more maneuverable at subsonic speeds, especially like this 17 here. And it would take American planes a chance to catch up, but they would see use throughout the war. It really wouldn't be until 1969 in Operation Linebacker and Linebacker 2 that Vietnam would deploy the MiG-19 in numbers. It would also form a third air group, but it never had more than, say, 50 or so in service at any given time. Interestingly, while it had Russian-made and Chinese-made other planes, all of its 19s were actually Chinese. They were the F-6, which was China's export variant of its J-6. I don't know, I was going to find that interesting. And it would serve throughout the latter half of Vietnam. In 1972, a MiG-19 would be involved in an incident where it was shot down by an F-4 using its cannon. And this would be the first time in history that a jet was shot down at supersonic speeds with a gun. We don't really know exact numbers. America says it shot down 10 MiG-19s being flown by the Vietnamese. The Vietnamese say it was 5. The Vietnamese claim 13 Allied aircraft shot down by MiG-19s, 7 of which they said were F-4s. Of course, the U.S.'s numbers are lower. It gets murky, doesn't really matter for this video. But it did see limited service in Vietnam, but not near as much as the 15 and especially the 17, and of course the later MiG-21 that would soon replace it everywhere. But the 19 did have some success in another part of the world. 1960, Egypt started incorporating the MiG-19 into its air force. And by the time of the 6 Days War, 1967, it had around 80. Now, while half were lost in that war, it would restore full strength by 1968, not by getting more planes from Russia, which this plane was already out of production or close to it by that point, but from other Middle Eastern nations that were flying it, for the most part Syria and Iraq. And it would continue to fly the MiG-19, but it would switch from using it as a daytime fair weather fighter to more of a close air support by the time of the Yom Kippur War. And it had about 60. It took advantage of the MiG-19's ability to carry unguided rockets and relatively light bombs, and would use it for that. But it was on the way out. Afterwards, it would just kind of be phased out. Iraq would have some up through the 1980s, then phase those out. Israel would tangle with them. They would actually go up against the Mirage-3 a number of times in the 60s and 70s. Sometimes the Mirage would get the better. Sometimes the MiG-19 would. It's kind of down to the skill of the pilot and the situation. A lot of interesting accounts there. North Korea, after 1961, would also take several MiG-19s in. These would be Russian-built, as far as I know. Maybe later some Chinese. I mention North Korea because they might be one of the last users. Even after the 21st century rolled over, North Korea was still showing over 100 19s in its Air Force. By today, I doubt many are flying because, it's long out of service. Because it was replaced by, of course, the MiG-21 here. The MiG-15 was a first-generation jet fighter. The 19 being supersonic, solidly second. The MiG-21 began as a second generation, late, but would bridge the gap into becoming a third. And also production. They would build about 12,000, at least, considering all variants and types, about 10,000 in Russia, others elsewhere. And it holds lots of records and distinctions because it was built from 1959 up through 1985, with the earliest prototypes even before that. Several versions and types. It was the first to be designed from the outset to take missiles. It used the K-5 originally, but once it got an improved SAP-4 radar, it would switch over to the K-13. I brought out the MiG-21 PFM variant here. So it's got some earlier features. The top-mounted Pt.3 tube. The earliest MiG-21s had it down below, like the MiG-19. This went back to using a single engine. The idea, they wanted a Mach 2 fighter, but it needed to be lightweight. And so it continues that trend of getting narrower. In fact, the wingspan is under 24 feet, but the overall length is about 48 feet, give or take, Pt.3 tubes and variants of the actual aircraft. And it is faster. The MiG-21 owns the 19 on top speed, but as far as maneuverability, especially at subsonic speeds, well, the 19 still might beat it. It could get up to over 1,300 miles per hour, Mach 1.765, so not quite a Mach 2 fighter, but it got there. Interestingly, they made the same mistake with the MiG-21 early on that America did with the F-4. In the very beginning, it didn't have a gun, at least not a built-in one, although they did have a gun pack that could be mounted on the center line. But of course, later aircraft would have internal guns. So again, early on, the 19 kind of still had the better gun options there, and the early K-5 missiles and even K-13s were nothing to write home about. So that kind of allowed the MiG-19 to remain relevant and important through about 1964-65. But by the time you get into the second generation MiG-21s, it's just better. Even if there's a few areas that the MiG-19 can outdo it, even when America tested one of these in the late 60s and early 70s, they fully acknowledged the MiG-19 had some benefits. They said it had good visibility from the cockpit. They loved the 30mm cannon and the ammo. But they admitted that the range was quite short, and to achieve its supersonic speeds, it had to burn afterburner, and that drank fuel very quickly. the MiG-21, especially early on, wasn't a lot better on the fuel. It kind of was a Soviet problem, frankly. Later versions of the MiG-21 did better with range, but these weren't going to be based on carriers anytime soon, if that makes sense. That's, yeah, MiG-21. I've done several videos. We can definitely revisit it. But, yeah, by the second generation of the MiG-21, as it crossed over into third generation fighter status, the MiG-19 was left in the dust, and that's why you see it leave Russian service in the 70s, and then other militaries usually quit flying it by the 80s. And it is often overlooked. The MiG-15 is famous because of Korea. The MiG-21 is famous because of Vietnam. But there's all that stuff in between, and that's the stuff I really love. And that's why I just really wanted the 19. Not only to complete the collection, especially once that MiG-31 comes out next year, but also just, it's an interesting plane. The same reason I like the F-100 Super Sabre. It's not my favorite plane ever, but it's a transition, and I like transitional aircraft. And this definitely had a place in history with the Vietnam War, and with all the conflicts in the Middle East. Like I said, the 6 Days War, the Yom Kippur War. These went up against the Mirage quite frequently. And of course, they served in China as the J-6 for a long time too. And I did want to bring this Vietnamese Camo 17 out. It is neat. But it really wasn't worth its own video, especially when I dorkily stuck some missiles under it. We'll call it one of the radar-equipped variants, huh? I wish Hobbymaster would do more of the interceptors. I do like them. So, the MiG-15 Fagot, the MiG-17 Fresco, MiG-19 Farmer, and of course, the MiG-21 Fishbed. Interesting names they picked. Well, I hope you enjoyed this kind of 3-part birthday video set. And I actually am very happy to report this Panzerkampf didn't let me down, because it would have kind of made me very sad if I had to put this next to some other MiGs, because most of my MiGs are from Hobbymaster, and even if the Hobbymaster are expensive, they do set a high standard. But the way this one uses magnets so well, it even impressed my wife. It does make sense if you're going to do diecast. As long as you use the right glue and stuff, caliber wings, magnets are a good idea. But they have to be done right, like anything else. Well, guys, better get to the work week. Hope everyone's doing well as we get pretty close to Thanksgiving. Please feel free to comment, share, all that good fun stuff. And if you'd like, go over and check out the main Mishaco channel, where we talk about Russian stuff a lot over there too. This is Misha. Get you very soon. Next time.